What's up, folks? Welcome back to the stream. We're both here, I guess. Inky's about to come hang out on stream for a bit. It's Tuesday. We're getting tactical once again. Thanks everyone for coming hanging out in chat. How's it going, everybody? Nurgle Matt's in here. All right. Are you gonna loom like a gargoyle? What's up? What are you doing, girl? Just chilling? All right, cool. When is embargo lifts? It should be this weekend. Usually it's 1 week before release, so I think that is probably what we'll get, I have to imagine. Hey, what's up? I'm just gonna put that on my face. All right, fair enough. For all the new stuff, we have new data slate. Embargoes for those are usually a little bit kind of funky. But also we have the big thing is obviously GT Arks of Omen, which is mostly what we're going to be talking about today. But I'll talk a little bit about data slate, I think, also. I'm here with my guest host, Inky. She's going to come chill on stream, I guess. And she knows all about Warhammer 40k and Arks of Omen. Tell us what you think about Arks of Omen, girl. What do you... No? Pre-nerf Tactical Tuesday. Start building Reavers for Marine list. I mean, yeah, Reavers have been bad for so long that it sure sounds like we're gonna have Reavers be the next best thing. That could certainly happen. So yeah, that's what's going on today. So kind of normal Tactical Tuesday stuff. We're not back to doing list reviews quite yet because there haven't been many events in the last week, and plus, like any events we talk about right now, any of the results are going to be, congratulations to everybody who wins an event within the next couple days. But the format is about to dramatically change. So, oh well. So yeah, what I'm going to be going over are some of my wish lists for GT Arks of Omen, which, by the way, might be it's certainly, I think, the most canine of the GT seasons because the abbreviation is AWOO, so it's going to be GT AWOO for a while. And then I have a couple thoughts about data slate stuff that we could see, or I would like to see, over and above what has been rumored so far in the potential leaks, the alleged leaks. Really interested in the 500-point Space Hulk games. Yeah, I think the boarding action games are going to be, absolutely sweet. Those sound amazing, and I hope that they're competitively viable as well, because I think that would be super cool. If you could, if you could make that work in a tournament format and the games weren't super long, if the games were, probably sub 45 minutes, which is what a Combat Patrol game is, then sick. I'm in. Plus no true line of sight. Oh my god. It's gonna be incredible. I can't wait for that format. I think it's gonna be amazing. All right, anyway, let's jump into it. I have a whole slideshow that I've got going on over here that we can talk about. War Dogs AWOO. Maybe it's War Dog meta, I guess. Well, yeah, I mean the Arks of Omen detachment is basically the same as the super heavy detachment from Chaos Knights, right? So I guess there's not too big of a change there to switch over to the Arks of Omen detachment, but certainly helps anybody trying to bring those big super heavies especially into an already existing list, because your super heavies get sub-faction abilities now, which is pretty cool, and not as useful for souping them, but pretty good if you're bringing in-faction guys. All right. Anyway, chat. Let's talk about some. We'll cast our minds back to back in the day when we played the GT Nephilim, which was like a week ago. I haven't played in a little while. I played one game last week, but mostly been doing holiday stuff. But we'd like to start by talking about sort of where we're coming from in the metagame. And I did make a little bit of a video about this on my second channel, talking about the kind of the power level of faction secondaries right now. And I did, as I was building this presentation, I just sort of did a run through of some recent faction or some recent, tournament results from the tail end of last year, and a lot of it is, you can sort of identify very clearly that there are that the factions that are successful, especially compared to factions that appear to be in a similar power level, is almost entirely their secondaries. So I know last week we talked about it on the last sort of regular Tactical Tuesday that we did. We talked about a lot of Blood Angels, and if you compare Blood Angels faction secondaries to any other Space Marine, you can ask yourself the question why they're doing so well, and one of the reasons is obviously their datasheets are strong. But I don't know if their datasheets are enough to sort of push them so far forward, but they have very strong faction secondaries between things like Fury of the Lost and Relentless Assault, and that's sort of a true across the board. So if you have 1 to 2 very strong faction secondaries, you're already going to be doing well, and if you're in a matchup where your 2 armies are of similar power level from your datasheet perspective, whoever has the best faction secondaries is going to win. And I don't think that that's a sustainable mode of play. I don't think that's very great. In some instances in the season, it's been kind of a little bit, I think some factions, I'm looking at Tyranids, were powerful enough that they could get around having bad faction secondaries, but so after being nerfed, I don't think that's the case anymore. And if you have good faction secondaries, then you're going to beat every faction that's sort of on a similar power level. Primary objective play was really striated. So, obviously, if you don't have good faction secondaries, the other thing you can do is try to dominate primary objective. That breaks down to basically 2 subcategories of army. I called them disruptors. So you can think about armies like Craftworld Eldar or Ynnari or Harlequins. Although they have solid faction secondaries, I wouldn't call them super broken. I'm again, Harlequins maybe be an outlier there. But something like Ynnari either has no faction secondaries at all. In some formats, you can't take their faction secondaries, we'll talk about later, or Craftworlds, and or Drakari even. They're this MSU style that's almost entirely built around taking objectives from your opponent over and over again and stopping them from scoring too many primary points. The other way to do it is score 1 billion primary points yourself. That's something like Heretic Astartes. That's one of the reasons that we see Chaos Space Marines have been doing pretty well, and especially factions like Thousand Suns. So that's kind of where we're coming from. And I would hope that moving into a new season, the goal of the design team would be to kind of disassemble this metagame and make it so that more factions can compete without basically falling into the category of either having good secondary, disrupting your opponent's primary, or tanking your own primary. And if a faction can do something else, that would be great. And to be fair, that's not entirely it's not 100% of factions, but I think that is going to be the majority of factions that we see. So that is what I have to say about that. So in an effort to do that, to hopefully start to disassemble this metagame, the preview articles have stated that the primary objectives are being reworked. Now, the way that they talked about it, and I talked about this in my video when the Arks of Omen preview article went up, the way that it was discussed in that article sounded like they were referencing the second player, the bottom round 5 scoring for second player. So currently, right now, in 9th edition, you score your primary objective points in your command phase, at the end of your command phase, except on the final round of the game, in which case, if you're the player going second, then you will score at the end of your turn. So that gives you the opportunity to run onto objectives and disrupt your opponent's scoring. And that most often means that if you're going second, you're going to be between 4 and 8 points ahead of the player going first on primary objectives. Now, that's become problematic because depending on the terrain format and depending on the faction you're playing, if you have decent enough secondaries that you can afford to, you're either encouraged to play very defensively or you can afford to play very defensively, you can just fall back on your bottom round 5 scoring, and you effectively have to do nothing during the game. So as long as you and your opponent can maintain parity on primary scoring, then you're not incentivized to move out of your deployment zone at all. or on secondary scoring, excuse me. So, for example, if you have a secondary like Raise the Banners High, or back in the GT Nakamun season, we saw this happen a lot with To the Last, or even a faction secondary like Stubborn Defiance, the one from Dark Angels. If you could score consistently on that secondary, on the objectives in your deployment zone, then you didn't need to move into the center of the table. If you had at least 2 objectives in easy reach of your deployment zone that you could hold, you were scoring 8 points a turn on most missions. And essentially all you needed to do is stop your opponent from scoring 12-point primary turns. So if they moved into the middle, you could sit back, you could shoot them off, you could trade a unit for it, and you didn't have to play aggressively at all. If the terrain format was defensive enough, then that meant that like a lot of games are sort of degenerated into either the player going second one at the end by a couple points, or the game just sort of ended up becoming this like this big nothing burger. That's not good. That's bad. So I think that the GT format has gone entirely 180'd from where on release it was so broken, where the first player had a dramatic advantage because they not only got to Alpha Strike, they not only got to set up for scoring first, so they were the first person to move on to objectives. So a lot of times the player going first would run up to the middle of the table. The player going second, in order to stop them from scoring a 12-point turn immediately, would have to also move up to the middle of the table. And if they didn't, the player going first would score 12 and then charge onto their home objectives, and they would score 0 and they would be out of the game entirely. So they had to add the second player scoring to make up for that deficiency. But I think that the nature of secondary objectives and how the edition has evolved has made that unnecessary. Now, I don't think that you can just do nothing, because I think that because just how 40k works, you can't have both players score on the same metrics, because first versus second in a battle round just sort of generically has you have a different play pattern. So what I'd like to see is, if primary objectives are being reworked, them to take some lessons from the ITC format back in 8th edition. So for those who didn't play in 8th edition and don't remember this, ITC was very similar to the current scoring, but it was a little bit less granulated. You scored, I think the maximum score was 40. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there. You played 6 rounds out. You scored 1 point during your turn if you held at least one objective. Sometimes there were 5 or 6 objectives on the table. All you needed to hold was one of them. You also scored 1 point per turn if you killed an enemy unit that turn, full stop. Then there were 2 bonus points up for grabs, one for at the end of the battle round holding more objectives than your opponent, the other one for at the end of the battle round killing more units than your opponent. That meant that the player going first got all the advantages we just talked about. They got to hit first, they got to set up to disrupt scoring on turn 2. To be fair, also in 8th edition, the terrain was much worse. So being able to strike first was a much bigger deal. But the flip side was that the player going second got to respond to whatever they did in order to try to get those 2 bonus points that were up for grabs. If the alpha strike from the first player was strong enough, you could be giving up those bonus points, and you weren't able to score them a couple turns. But if the player going first didn't sort of take advantage enough of the initiative that they got, you could steal 2 extra points from them at the end of every round. The things that they did was not only is it forced engagement in a lot of situations. Killing people meant that ranged armies had a little bit of an advantage because you could score primary points just by shooting. But on the flip side, if you played a very aggressive like MSU style army, you could score that hold more at the end. So it allowed for different game plans to engage with the primary in their own way without sort of being alienated, I guess. Whereas, as we talked about in the previous slide, there's only like 3 game plans right now in the GT pack. So now I don't know if moving to that system is like the way forward. I do think it's a little archaic, but I would like to see at the very least a system like end of turn scoring. So instead of being forced to move up to an objective and stand on that objective for a battle round and potentially die, which means that basically the only units that can move aggressively into the center of the table are hyper tanks, because everything else will just be killed and not do anything. If you have an MSU style army, you can run to the center objective and score it. And potentially having some sort of end of round scoring to rebalance that first versus second player dynamic. So you can give the first player these benefits, but then also have a built-in benefit for the second player as well. Yeah, so I think, interestingly, I do have some, I think I'm speaking from a perspective of rose-tinted glasses here. I'll recognize my bias, because I really liked End of 8th Edition ITC. And there were definitely some problems that could be fixed up. But I think post, there was a point where CZ Initiative was still in the game, and ITC Packet removed it for ITC games. And that was like end of 2019. I made a video on it, I think. That was like one of my first videos on this channel that did pretty okay, which was kind of got me excited. I put a lot of, I remember I was working on an office and I stayed late and I edited that video on my laptop in my office. And I remember when that happened because it was so exciting, because CZ Initiative was like the worst mechanic in the game. ITC just said we're not playing with it anymore, and it was the greatest thing ever, and it made the format really good. And I think we should go back to that. I think a system that's similar to that, I think would be good. Now, I don't know exactly what that looks like right now. Obviously, I'm not on the design team. So I don't do this. I don't write these rules full time, but I do think that was a healthier system than the current GT system that we have now. Obviously, there's sort of personal biases, I think, within especially the GT design team. The system that we're using with right now was developed out of the Nova system, which was kind of a mess, and that's just sort of how it is. But I do think that moving to a slightly different system is the way to go. Sigma grind set mentality. Yeah, I mean, it's staying late to work on something that wasn't work. I don't know, does that count? I don't have to do that anymore. Sick. All right, let's move on. We talked about primary objectives. Let's talk about some friggin' secondary objectives, chat. Here's a hot take, everybody. I don't like kill secondaries. Secondaries that say kill X number of unit type. I've never liked that. And I understand that there is a purpose for them, which is to disincentivize people from spamming particularly strong unit types that are in a format. I think, going back to talking about ITC, I think this is another evolution from ITC. Whereas ITC was a separate structure from from GW proper, and they were sort of working secondhand to us to sort of input. I don't know if I want to say like balance changes, but to try to guide the balance of the game. And not having any ability to affect how powerful units and datasheets were themselves, the only way that you could redress the format would be to disincentivize people from playing these particular unit types. And that has just been tacked along with the GT packet. The difference here is that the ball is in the people who write the GT packet's court to not make those unit types spammable. But we still have these secondaries that are dedicated to punishing them for like really no reason. And now we're running into these issues where either the way the format works, the way other secondaries work, and the way that codexes have been written, in some cases, either require or reinforce a particular unit type being played by a particular army. So, for an example would be like a Space Marine army, and especially if we're staring down a barrel of Space Marines getting huge points breaks. We're talking about a Space Marine army where you have a lot of multi-wound infantry. And in some sub-factions, you have no other way to build that army. If you have no benefits for vehicles, there's no vehicles that are good for your game plan, you're going to be spending your points on multi-wound infantry and on characters, which automatically means assassination and no prisoners are on the table for you. And there's nothing you can do about that, besides like literally playing a different army. And I think that it hurts the game at this stage. I'm not convinced that there are like skew spam archetypes right now. And this could obviously change once you see the full format because the AWU detachment is wild. I'm not convinced that there are skews that are hard enough with how lethal 9th edition is right now to like entirely like break the system. And you end up, especially if you're a faction that let's take Death Guard, right? We're like the lists in Death Guard that are good, if they're not running PBCs, which are probably not, usually have a ton of multi-wound infantry in them. So you're basically just like, you're just going to give up no prisoners if you're bringing a normal list. You have a bunch of ground pounding duders, and you just will give up the secondary, despite the fact that Death Guard are not a particularly strong faction right now, and that like archetype a lot of times is not beneficial, especially if you're running into a faction that has good sweepers that can get through that style of profile. So factions that are not at the upper echelon of competitive play and have to rely on particular data sheets to survive just get nailed for no reason. So I'm talking specifically about secondaries like Bring It Down, No Prisoners, Assassination, Abhor the Witch. I don't think we need them, and I think the game would be better off leaving them on the table. You can also look at factions like Chaos Knights, right? Like Chaos Knights have no particularly strong faction secondaries, but every single time a Chaos Knights player puts an army down on the table, they're giving their opponent 15 points on Bring It Down. They're playing 15 points down, despite the fact that their best faction secondary probably caps at 12. So like, you're just playing 2 or 3 VP down for bringing a Chaos Knights army, and that's why you can't bring any non-knight vehicles or non-knight units. Everything's a vehicle in that army. So, like, I don't know. That would frustrate me to no end playing Chaos Knights. At least some other factions, you have potentially the option to bring like non-infantry vehicles or vice versa if you're focusing on one or the other unit type. But some armies just don't. They just don't, or they're playing hugely suboptimally, and either way, you're giving up efficiency for not really any reason. Grind Them Down's a little different, I think, because Grind Them Down doesn't focus on a particular unit type, chat. I'm mostly talking about the secondaries that are meant to punish skew. CSM also like this. Yeah, CSM's I think a pretty decent example too. CSM Chaos Space Marines tend to run enough elite infantry that they can bypass it, right? Like Chaos Space Marines, I think, lean into it because their infantry is that good. I'm mostly worried about the effect on factions that do not have another game plan, where like either they're monsters or either they're a million characters or any of these things, and then they just get destroyed by these secondaries for no reason. So yeah. So I wish that, especially with how hard GW, the design team's like pushing these data slates, if the goal is to reduce the skew of these unit types, you can just make them worse. It's okay. Or you can impose limits on them, or you can make them more difficult to include in detachments. I do think, honestly, the one caveat to this is that, because I mentioned before that the format might change things, but the AWU detachment is probably going to force skews. So there may be like an argument for retaining anti-skew technology in the format. But on the other hand, it's only really going to punish the factions that have to skew. Or that like have to skew and don't even have great skews, or that like can't build in another direction, because the best factions in the game can typically play around that. play around that sort of skew focus. So that's the caveat I'll add, is the format may end up requiring it, but at least based on what we know about the Nephilim format from our experience there, I don't think that they're entirely necessary. Yeah, Grey Knights with the Pour the Witch, I think that's a good one too. Like, that's not, like, you can't play around that as a Grey Knights player, right? Like, you could take, like, Land Raiders and Servitors. Sick. Amazing. Like, that's how we stop from giving up Pour the Witch. Or you just give up a 15er. It's like, come on, man. Yeah. Yeah, Abhor the Witch is like, I think Abhor the Witch is just, I don't know. I don't. I understand the reasoning behind Abhor the Witch, that it was like, well, this is an entire tree of secondaries that only armies that have access to Psychers can take. But on the flip side, okay, that's so few factions. It's like Necrons, right? Like, the factions in the game that do not have access to Psychers full stop are, it's Necrons and Tau. That's it, right? And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if you're still, it's not like you're not giving up efficiency by taking Warpcraft secondaries, because you still have to have a Psyker that then does nothing for a turn in order to score it. So it's like, yeah, it's, I don't know. It's like if you had a character that had to do a Banner's action every turn, and you're like, oh no, if now we should give a benefit to every faction that doesn't take characters, because this one character has to not do anything for the entire game. Like, it's just not. It's just not very well thought out, for sure. It's called Awuga. Awu GT. Awuget. Necrons Tau World Eaters? World Eaters, whatever. That's just chaos. That's just mixed chaos. You can take a Chaos Knight in that list that has the psychic upgrade, right? You can have an Abominant in that list. Just give Necrons a good Warcraft secondary. Yeah, why don't Necrons have a faction secondary that's like do a thing with a Catan, and that's their Warcraft? Or just give, like, Necrons any other good secondary. Whatever, Necrons had great secondaries. I don't think Necrons are crying to the bank. Like, oh no, our faction secondaries are so bad because we don't have Warcraft. Get out of here, faction with the best faction secondaries. Yeah. All right. So that's one of the things I had to say. The other one is I would like to see, I think my favorite style of objectives are objectives that you don't have to kill, you don't have to, like, fight your opponent for, right? But that require you to sort of move out of your comfort zone. You have to go do a thing to score them. So these are things like maneuver objectives. So you can imagine stuff like the old school Stranglehold. That was a hugely transformative change when they removed that from the game. Engage on all fronts, which has been nerfed so many times, I think you could put it back to like an old version, and I think it would be fine. Those would be sort of a maneuver style. And then objective secondaries that are like predicated on holding objectives. I think specifically, like, especially objectives in aggressive positions. If you have the defensive secondaries that you can formulate in a way that, like, you can build for but aren't automatically scoreable, I think that's interesting. So I noted a Promethean Creed here, and I think Promethean Creed is a really cool ability because you pick a secondary, you pick an objective, you score a little bit of points for holding it, but you also score points for taking damage on it. And I think that's super cool. And I would like to see more effects like that in the game, where you can reward tanky armies for being tanky, but don't require them to move to the center of the table. And also there's counterplay, right? Because your opponent can take this, they can give you a thing to shoot at and say, I'll score if you shoot me. And you can choose not to shoot them, and you can choose to, use other effects and screening and jamming and debuffs and things to get around attacking this unit, so you limit your opponent's score on that secondary. I think effects like that are super interesting. And then also just action secondaries, stuff like raise the banners, stuff like retrieve Nephilim data. They require like a particular build to do. If you're good at doing them, you can construct around it, but they all force you to give up using that unit in an aggressive way in order to score. I think that is where secondary objectives should be pushing. I don't like the secondary objectives that you can score by just playing the game normally. I think that all the secondaries should have like a counterplay to them. And that goes back to the kill secondaries. Those kill secondaries are especially good if your opponent is going to be incentivized or required to move the units that you score off of up to the middle of the table. So for example, you're playing Chaos Knights, you have to move your War Dogs onto the opponent's objectives to stop them from scoring and to score your own secondaries. And then your opponent just gets points for them. Like, you might as well not show up because, like, you're giving up the secondary that you then have there's no way that you stop scoring it. But I think those secondaries that ask you to perform, to do something, are much better than the ones you just score by passively playing 40k. And I would like to see an emphasis on those, especially in the standard objectives, just outside of secondary, as faction secondaries. I don't think it should all be in faction secondaries. Never take the faction secondaries from Chaos Space Marines. They're pretty bad. Yeah, it's usually like you're on the Legion ones. The EC one is good and the COB one is good, right? The COB one's okay. Secondaries need to have you think and do something awkward you wouldn't do as part of your primary. Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Yeah, Storm of Darkness is like a really good example of like a not very well formulated faction secondary. It's like, you're gonna score 9. Like, you're gonna go out of your way to do this thing and then score 9 points on it. You're like, okay. And then in order to do that, you're like putting yourself in the middle of the table. Your opponent's gonna attack you and kill you, and you're like, great, cool. So like, I'm gonna score 3 points for storming the center objective, and then lose 2 points for you killing my War Dog that's standing on it. What a trade! I feel great about this. Net one VP and -1 War Dog. What a good time. Everybody's having a great time. Yeah. So that's what I'd like to see about secondary objectives. Now we're in the weeds of faction secondaries, which is good because faction secondaries are my next slide. Now, the first bullet point here is not a wish list because it's confirmed, right? Because it was in the preview article. There are only 3 faction secondaries for each faction. So that's good to know. 3 faction secondaries, and I guess I should put in that they noted 1 sub-faction secondary. I'm pretty sure that was what the article... It's certainly what the article implied. I don't know if they said it outright. Which I think is great. Just reducing the bloat, and then the factions that had 4 to choose from for like no reason were kind of like had an extra leg up. They had an extra like roll at the roll of the dice to try to get a good faction secondary. But I think the problem that I'll state first that I like faction secondaries as a concept, but I think that their implementation is a little flawed. Largely because probably the team that's creating them is undermanned and probably underpaid. Where we're trying to build secondary objectives, and I'm sure they're mandated to build secondary objectives for every sub-faction, and they're building secondary objectives for every faction, which is what, like 20 factions? How many factions are there in the game? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 26? Like 25, I guess, if you cut, or 24 if you cut the Titan Legions. So we have to build, that's already X3 72 faction secondaries, and then they also built a second tree for like half the sub-factions in the game, which is too many. It's too many to like maintain consistent balance on all of them. And so I think that what they should have done, and what they need to do is like standardize their approach to faction secondaries, where every faction, now this is also assuming that you can take more than 1 faction secondary. If you can only take 1 faction secondary, I think they should, that's actually probably harder to balance than the reverse, because you have to make sure that that 1 faction secondary doesn't skew like every matchup, and that it's also reasonably balanced with all 2 other faction secondaries in the in that pool. And I think that gets very difficult. But if you can take multiple faction secondaries, you can have the potential that an army has its identity built around taking multiple of them. But then you like striate their power levels. So I think every faction deserves to have one decent faction secondary. I'm not going to say that they should be all like 100% takeable, but I think that they should be like, at the very least, if you can't think of another, oops, sorry, Jen. At the very least, if you can't think of another faction secondary, another secondary to play, you can fall back on your faction secondary. Those ones should likely be capped around 12 VPs. And I think another big problem that we have currently with faction secondaries is a lot of times they're just like, well, here's a really good secondary, go wild. And you're like, but why is this one twice as easy to score as any book secondary and also cap at 15? Whereas like book secondaries are often capped at 12 for no reason. So I think they should impose like more stringent caps on the stronger secondaries, and then from there, every faction should have a selection of build around secondaries. And I think a good example of this is like Fury of the Lost, where it's a strong secondary. It's not the best secondary ever, but it will oftentimes net you between 10 and 13 points probably, but only if you build a specific way. And in a way that might not entirely be optimized. Fury of the Lost is a little bit funky because it like synergizes really well with Relentless Assault, the other good secondary in Blood Angels, and Death Company are a decent unit already. But if you have, build around objectives where you score a bunch of points by like killing people with, battle tanks or something, right? Then, or doing like a specific action with a specific type of unit, like Scout the Enemy, for example, where you can get points on it by performing an action with anybody in your army, but it has this huge buff if you perform it with a specific unit type. So you're incentivized to skew your army in a way that you normally wouldn't. But if you do, you have another option. I like those a lot. And I think you could put one or two of those in there and have them branch in different directions. So you can either build like, well, I'm taking the Death Company build to get Fury of the Lost, but I could also build a different direction towards like, I don't know, like Inceptors or something that doesn't necessarily synergize with the original one, but gives you a different option to build your army into. And then the last one can kind of be whatever. You can have like a thematic objective, like a challenge objective, because the intention is that the third one is there, if you need it, and in very specific situations, you can make it like hyper narrow use case, but it's not intended to be played every game. And I would like to see, instead of the team being like, all right, well, here's your action secondary, here's your maneuver secondary, here's your kill secondary, and they're all like, just sort of like, they're just like throwing darts at a board of how powerful they are. They're just like, I don't know, this effect seems like it's cool for the army. We'll just put that in there. Herd the Prey is a Drukhari thing. We'll just give it to Necrons. I don't know, whatever, who cares? Instead of doing that, I would like there to be a much more regimented approach to that. Relentless Assault still are all around better than Fury of the Lost? Oh, I 100% agree with you, Rezial. Don't get me wrong. Relentless Assault is phenomenal, but one of the reasons that the reason I mentioned it is that one of the reasons that Fury of the Lost is so good is because as you're playing aggressively with these Death Company to score Fury of the Lost, they're also going to naturally get you a Relentless Assault. So you're already going to build around, you're probably going to build around Fury of the Lost already, but then it has like this additional synergy. So I think that was maybe like a worse, that's a good example of a build around objective that I really like, but I think in this case it's a little worse because it's like, it's better, like the two secondaries together are better than the sum of their parts, and it's like one of the most unique situations. Like, I don't know if there are any secondaries that like mesh like that. It used to be that like retrieve Nachmund data and engage in all fronts had the same like synergy where you would like port, I played Tyranid, so it was like port a Lictor into your back line and be like, I'm gonna score engage on that guy and retrieve Nachmund, so that guy's worth like 5 points. It's basically that, which is a little different. Death from Above synergizes with Inceptors, but Inceptors are expensive. Yeah, also Death from Above isn't that great, right? Like, that's the other problem. You'd be much more excited about playing Inceptors to score Death from Above if Death from Above was like awesome and or had like a sweet buff for Inceptors. It was like, score 1 point if you killed a unit with a unit that came in from reserve this game. 2 additional points if it was Inceptors. You'd be like, I'll take a unit of 5. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Oh, the Vuitton kill secondary synergize? I only ever see people take Ancestors are watching. I don't see... What's the other one? Grudge Match? I basically have, like, never seen someone take that. What do they do? I already had Vuitton secondaries up. Identify 5 units. You get 1 victory point, additional victory point if they were 150 points or more, and if 1 additional victory point if you killed them in melee. I guess that counts. That's basically... It's 2 objectives that say kill your opponent with attacks. So that seems fine. I don't know if that's like an explicit synergy as much as it is like, you know, it's like saying that you could score, like, bring it down and grind them down at the same time. Like, they both say you destroy units. Like, Tau Fireware is a complete decisive or aerospace targeting faster than other Tau infantry. Yeah, something similar to that. That one's a little bit. I guess it's an okay example, but it is generally that Fire Warriors are like too slow to actually complete that secondary. But you can. I would say, like, on the whole, that's like sort of what I'm talking about, but on like a more dramatic level. Yeah. Blood Angels have decent secondary play. I agree. Yeah. But I think Blood Angel secondaries are the reason that the faction's good. For sure. I think if, yeah, I mean, if Blood Angels were, like, we're missing one of those secondaries, their win rate would be, like, drop dramatically. Those two sticking together, I think, is the reason that that faction's solid. All right. So that's what I have to say about faction secondaries. Next up, we'll talk about the real wish list here, chat. This is mostly reworks that I'd like to see. Honestly, I don't know if we'll see them. But are you ready to get into the weeds, everybody? Let's talk about it. I call this pie in the sky stuff because I don't believe for a hot minute that these will actually happen, but a man can dream. The first one is event guidelines. It has tickled me endlessly that Games Workshop has released a document for sale called Grand Tournament, in which the rules to running a grand tournament are in no way broken down. So, like, how do you do pairings? How should tiebreakers be done? No one knows. If you were not enfranchised in the competitive community, and you and your 6 friends were like, dude, I got this book called Grand Tournament. Let's go play a tournament in my basement on Saturday. You would not know how to do that because it doesn't tell you. And I think both of these points are basically just about standardization of the community. And I think it's like low key. I think it's a huge mark against competitive 40k play that there is no standardization across different events. And some people like that. Some people like that there's different formats and different things can be good in different formats. I think it's personal preference. I tend to... I would prefer that different formats have distinctly different rules. Whereas the formats, as we can talk about them within the 40k community, are just house rules that are applied to play a game of 40k. They're different terrain sets, they're different scoring metrics, they're different tiebreakers, and they change how people approach the game. And that's, I mean, from the perspective of somebody who, you know, spends a lot of time trying to analyze 40k metagame, it's like impossible. If you have to look up every single event, like what terrain set they used, if they used their own bespoke terrain set, you had no idea what they were doing. If they used WTC scoring, if they used like a win path tiebreaker, those all change the event results, and it's frustrating. And a book called Tournament, that has tournament in the name, should describe these things, because that is integral to running a tournament. So event guidelines would be the first thing. And you can even say, like, hey, here are, and this is what I think most other games that have organized play documents like these have a guideline that says, here's how you play a tournament, but also here are some options that you can use to slightly alter the rules. And they have those broken down. And you could even just do that. But having every single event decide independently, means that some people are going to be better than others. Some people are going to reinvent the wheel and create their own scoring system that is one iota different than a different one that somehow that changes like the final pairings and changes how placings are determined. And that's not even to mention terrain. So we talked about this on stream, I think last week, but one of the things I look for every time I start a new miniatures game, which I've done way too many times, by the way, is I look at how they approach their terrain rules. And if they do not have, I almost immediately write off the game if they do not have either guidelines for how terrain should be implemented, or at the very least sort of strict rules that incentivize these strict terrain setups. In my opinion, it is inappropriate for a miniatures game, which as a genre tends to rely very heavily on its terrain, to not have terrain be baked into the game from the start. So what I mean by that, right, is terrain, and this was super bad in 8th edition. It's less so in 9th, but it was so bad in 8th edition. Terrain was like an appendix rule in 8th edition. If you were to play 8th edition 40k out of the box, you would basically not have terrain in it, which is unplayable. The game just doesn't work. And it's the same for 9th edition, except that 9th edition has a more, at least there's more deliberate design behind the 9th edition terrain rules. But nowhere is it stated what you are supposed to use for terrain. And I think that's thoroughly inappropriate for a game that's trying to bill itself as a competitive game. And I think it's especially so for Games Workshop for 40k, because 40k is a game that lives and dies on terrain. If you have bad terrain, you go second against a shooting army. The event set up 2 ruins in the middle of the table and was here's your Nova Elves, go, have a great time. And then you just get shot off the table and the game's over. A lot of times you can lose the game, partially because of faction of secondaries we talked about before. But I effectively lost the game recently because I lost a unit of gargoyles in the first turn because I couldn't physically hide it behind the terrain that was on the table. And you suddenly I didn't have a unit fast enough to get this objective on turn 1 because the rest of my army was hiding. I would have lost actual units had I not had those gargoyles there. I couldn't put banners down because I couldn't get into range, and it the whole game sort of falls apart if you don't have terrain that is at least standardized that you can build armies around. So even if events don't use them, I think that I would like the GT packet to have a map, or 3 or 4 maps that are this is what a GT 40k table should look like. And events will decide not to use that. That's just how the 40k community is. There's no way that UKTC is GW released a new terrain map, we'll adopt that. They won't. They're going to use their own thing. But at the very least, we have an example of what Games Workshop wants people to use. US Open is a step towards that, but it's not official. It's just per what it's per what one of the terrains the competitive systems that Games Workshop recommends. But it's not official enough. It's not sort of diagrammed in official capacity. And even if it is US Open, I don't know if I would love it to be US Open. I think US Open's a little bit stale at this point. But even if it is US Open, just give us something. Oh my God. And then, then we can, I don't know, then at least we have a reference point for what the game wants us to do. But realistically, I think that is a huge strike against Warhammer 40,000, that it has no sort of It doesn't tell you what to do with your terrain. That's unacceptable. It's not good enough. It's very bad. Yeah. Yep. So I think if GW put directions like that in the book, most events would follow. Yes. I think, well, so here, yeah. So like I said, I think that there are event systems that would not, right? I think that WTC does their own thing, which is fine. I've said this on the channel before, but WTC 40k is not actual 40k. The games themselves pretend to be a game of 40k, but the rules that they use are just like totally divorced from actual 40k rules. That's whatever, right? UKTC has their own thing. They like do whatever they want over there and get shot to death by Tau or whatever. That's whatever. But at least from my experience, there are so many small events that are run by people who aren't like, you know, these hyper enfranchised people that think about terrain systems all the time. And when US Open came out and Games Workshop was like, here is an example of terrain that we're using for a tournament, there were dozens, hundreds even, of like smaller like event organizers and smaller venues that just went like, amazing. We're gonna use that. Like now there is a standard. We don't have to like research it ourselves and go through play testing and all this stuff. We have an example that we can do. And there it is, done. And I think I'm not naive enough to say that I think that the community would adopt a standardized terrain system, but I do think that enough people would that it would like eventually become a real thing. Yeah, the rule books always have like an example of a board. They're like, this is one way you could set up terrain. And they always have that that annoying percentage, like you should have 25% of your table covered in terrain or whatever. And it's like, what does that mean? It's meaningless. It doesn't do anything. Plus the terrain, if you're playing an optimized 40k army, like the terrain types that are in the book, if you use the GW keywords and you don't change anything and you play like the GW recommended like table that has like their plastic terrain on it with the keywords that they recommend, it doesn't do anything. It's like half the map gets dense cover and you're like, okay, well I'm like +2 to hit, ignoring cover, full rerolls. Like it does, dense cover is not gonna oftentimes dense cover is not gonna save your army from my army if I go first, because you have no line of sight blockers in reasonable places. They could even sell vinyl mats. Yeah, they could monetize it. Could you imagine? Imagine if GW made a competitive terrain set every edition or something. Amazing. Any indication when the rules release? We'll probably see previews this weekend, and they're out next week. They're out on the 15th, or the weekend of the 15th, so the 14th, I think. Do you like that US Open terrain isn't skewed to favor shooting? Yeah, I think that it might be, I don't know. I go back and forth. I think that it might be like too far in favor of melee armies. But there are so many terrain systems that are just like, if I go first with a gun, you're dead. And you're just like, come on, cool. That sucks. I do think that there is like a problem with 40k of like losing units before they activate. That's always been the problem, right? And especially now that scoring is so tight, like the system has been designed so that like games always come down to these very low point scoring. If you lose a unit before it gets you any victory points, well, oftentimes you lose the game. And I think that's sort of the deeper the deeper issue. But you can design your armies around that with greater effectiveness if you know what your terrain looks like. If you're going to any event and you're like, I have no idea what the board's gonna look like, and I've done this before where I built an army to play in like a pretty heavily terrained system, and my first round at a GT, I played against it on a table that had no line of sight blocking in relevant places. Like my opponent just had free line of sight to my entire deployment zone. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. So I was playing this army that was like trying to hide behind an obscuring terrain and couldn't do anything. And like that just happens if you don't have standardized terrain. It's just real shitty. So yeah. And I think And I do agree with the point earlier that I think that skewing for melee armies is healthier than skewing for shooting armies. As it turns out, this is what I like to always tell people. Like, as it turns out, you might not know this, little known fact, but you can shoot people that are very close to you. You can also, the difference is that you can also shoot them if they're very far away from you. And if you're a melee army, you cannot melee them if they're very far away from you. You can only melee them if you're close. So oftentimes in 9th edition 40k, shooting armies that are built to shoot are powerful enough that their shooting attacks are as powerful as an equivalent melee attack from a melee army. And if you're allowed to make those attacks targeting the melee army from the first turn, whereas they can only melee you from turn 3 onwards, there is no way that they're ever going to win. Which means you always have to skew terrain towards melee armies. Whether or not that it should, the exact proportion of that I think is up for debate, but I'm in favor of skewing more defensively than less, for sure. Alternating activation could solve it. We've talked about alternating activation on the stream before, I think. Alternating activation is not a solution to your problems, chat. Yeah, reset the clock. You're gonna get the meme. Yeah. Alternating activation is not this magical balm that immediately repairs game design. Oh, guys, we've done it. We put alternating activation in our game. It's a modern game now, and every alternating activation game is perfect balance, and the system's never any problems. No. Alternating activation is not appropriate for 40k. It would be a disaster. A disaster. You would redesign the game from the ground up. You have to make a hybrid system. You can't just stick in your units alternate and activate and it's fine. Not good. Would be bad. Dalton, your region plays GW terrain mostly and it's wonderful. Yeah. I don't think it's perfect for sure. And it can skew a little bit depending on exactly what your terrain looks like. Sometimes you see people who play the US Open terrain, but their buildings are all 2 inches smaller than they should be. And suddenly it goes from covering pretty reasonable size, but because it's all 4 directions. If your building is a 10-inch building instead of a 12-inch building, the amount of coverage that it has is exponentially lower. So it's not perfect, and that's going to be the case for every event for sure. But it's better than nothing for sure. It's better than what we had in 8th, which was just Wild West, which is whatever happens. So I think there's a place for a boarding action series in T5S2. Yes. If the rules are good, Kellen, I will run one. Let's go. Let's bring CPCS back. I included that clip. That was one of my favorite clips I think that I've ever streamed in that video about the boarding action rules. Just with how zany and insane a 500-point game of 40k is. Suddenly one dice spike is the craziest thing ever. One person navigating a combat phase effectively is just whoa, that changes everything. That's so crazy. Whereas 40k, it's so much blank action a lot of times. You're oh, good, you did your pile and consolidates perfectly, but it didn't matter because it was 10 idiots on the side of the board that aren't affecting the scoring at all. Whereas in a 500-point game of 40k, it's crucial. Your 40k fundamentals are so important in those games, and it makes it so cool and exciting. If boarding action's good and the mechanics are solid and the missions are solid, I'm so in. I think it's gonna be sweet. Seen GBW open events that use Nova Alice for the big ruins doesn't stop shooting armies much. It does a little bit though. Right? And I think it I have played on the Nova L buildings for sure. And I think it's better than nothing, right? You could have the Nova L not be there and then it doesn't do anything. But I think it works well. Unless you mean Nova Ls with no bases on them, right? All the events that I've ever played in use the Nova L with the base, with the 12 by 12 base. But if you mean just the L, yeah, that actually doesn't do anything. It's garbage. Get that out of there. That's Yeah, that's some real end of 8th edition kind of energy. Thing you keep seeing for GW letters are either 4 big L's in the middle or 2 big U's in the middle, or 4 big U's in the middle. Yeah, so the benefit of the U.S. Open, I think, even more so than the standardization is just the requirement that there are huge obscuring bricks, right? So like, even if you get nothing else about it right, it's just, even if there's no 3-dimensional terrain on the table at all, it's just the fact that if you go by U.S. Open, the U.S. Open layout, you have obscuring terrain. There's obscuring terrain there, and I played on U.S. Open layouts that like don't have the correct like 3-dimensionality. They're like too low. They have holes in them. Whatever. They don't like hold, prevent line of sight very well. But you don't get shot off the table on your first turn, and like, it's not perfect, but we're getting somewhere. Whereas there are some events where those are just L's in the middle, and you have nothing in your deployment zone. There's no like line to hide behind that can prevent line of sight from going through. There's like nothing. There's nothing there. So I think compared to the nightmare that is like no standardization in terrain formats, it's better. It's better than nothing. Better than nothing. Yeah, the WTCLs, like, they have bases on them, right? But they also use like 20 of them. I think it's different if you're like, well, there's 4 Nova Ls on the table, and you're like, okay, well, we can go around that. The WTC maps are like, there's 2 Nova Ls in the middle, and then there's 2 next to those, and then there's 2 on either side of those. And then if you imagine like a fractal, it just keeps going, and there's like smaller and smaller Ls as you try to draw a line of sight, and there's like there's an infinite barrier of tiny L's that prevent your line of sight from going through. Like, the WTC is very different. Local GW also runs 750 and 1K point tournaments. Also crazy fun days. It's fun to see jank. Yeah, 1,000 points is like a Wild West. I've never played 1,000 points before. But I had a local store that used to run 500s. They would run like a 500 point. They would run like pods, like 8-person pods on a weeknight, on like Wednesdays. And each game was like sub an hour, so you would get done, like you would start at 7 or whatever, and you'd get done before 10, which is like pretty solid to get 3 games in and then like have prizes and everything. And they were good fun for sure. And one time they would so every once in a while they would throw in like a special rule where like you could one time they said I think you could play Unbound, and they had a couple balance rules where like you couldn't play Lords of War and you couldn't play like more than 1 vehicle or monster, I think, stuff like that. And then they would have like special events where they would just remove the guidelines, and then just like the wackiest stuff would come up. I played 2 Hive Tyrants like against Mortarion, I think was like the wildest one that I had. Just hilarious. 1,000 is officially supported by Nephilim. Yeah, they are in the incursion missions are in the Nephilim pack for sure. They just don't normally see play. I think the issue with incursion is that it plays on half the table size that 2,000 points do, but it doesn't like make any. It doesn't make any like the half table size is mostly intended for 500 points. When you double to 1,000, your damage output increases significantly, but like the amount of defensive. Like your ability to defend against it doesn't. So you end up like having like these big alpha strikes, I think. If you increase the table size, if you play it on like a 4x4, it'd probably be fine, I think. Yeah, so the downside I have of 1K tournaments is that unlike 500 points, 1,000 points is harder to like police like weird combos, and the game is so lethal that like you can cripple 1,000. Like 1,000 points in 40k can cripple another 1,000 points much more easily than at 500 or at 2,000, which sounds weird, right? But like at 2,000, you end up with so much. You end up requiring a lot of like toolbox stuff to score all your secondaries and things. At 1,000, you can just shave all of that away, take only lethality, and just kill your opponent. And then 500, you don't have enough points for the lethal stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's kind of like a sad medium, I guess. It's like right at the point where Warhammer like flips over the cusp of like of damage. Like there's a ledge of damage that it falls off of, but like doesn't yet have at the smaller table size, like doesn't yet have the requirement to spread as much as 2,000 points does. I don't know. That's my opinion anyway. All right. Everything I discussed is going to destroy point scoring for Imperial Knights. Yeah, removing Bring It Down would be so sad for Imperial Knights. They would hate it. They would be so upset. They would just like be wailing in the streets. No, my opponent doesn't get 15 points for playing against me. This is so sad. All right, chat. Let's talk about data slate stuff. So this is we'll get a little silly here because that was all I have to say about AWU, the AWU GT system. I would like to see those things implemented. I hope they do. But now we can talk about some data slates. Yeah, Rezio, that's a really good point about the balance, the balance level of 40k. I understand that like as sort of a marketing tactic, it's important that 40k be scalable, but it's not designed for those points levels. So they're inevitably busted, whereas they don't have quite the same problems at the larger sizes. All right, let's talk about data slates. So this is stuff in the upcoming data slate I would like to see change, some interesting things. I've got 2 pages of these, so there's a couple of them. It's not super holistic, but the important thing that I didn't really touch on factions that are rumored to be changing significantly. So like I could talk your ear off about what I think should change for Tyranids, but the rumor is that the faction is being returned to the earth, buried at sea, as it were. So I didn't include them. But there are some other stuff that didn't get talked about quite as much. That only got talked about a little bit that we're going to talk about. All right, here you go. First one, fortifications. They're just broken right now. Fortifications require special rules in your event packet to be playable, like in a competitive venue. I think we've talked in the past about like spore assist lists, like in Tyranid armies, right? Where there are Tyranid armies in the current format that are doing very well with spore assists. The problem is that if you play like US Open, for example, and do not have special rules for the placement of spore assists, they're actually hot garbo. They don't do anything because the only place they can get legally placed, sometimes it's just in your opponent's clear line of sight and they just shoot them immediately because they're like T6, or they're in the back corner of your table edge and they don't affect the table in an interesting way. The problem is, like on the whole, I don't think that these fortifications that are having problems are that problematic. But we'll never know because they're totally non-viable because of their placement restrictions. So right now, you cannot place fortifications per the core rules if they're within 3 inches of any other terrain feature, full stop, end of story. And that's too much of a detriment. If you have terrain in reasonable places where it protects your army from being attacked, those are typically also the places that you want to place your fortifications so they can actually affect the board. So, which means that if the only time a fortification is good is if the terrain you're playing on is hot garbage. And that's just bad. Now, the impetus behind that rule is to prevent fortifications from being used like as movement blockers, where you can entirely wall off sections of the table by placing fortifications adjacent to terrain. However, most fortifications these days work as normal units. They just are like a vehicle that can't move, which means if your opponent is worried about being movement restricted, you can just charge them. They can increase your movement. They're also not generally that hard to kill. They're, especially with like, we're seeing these new Land Raider profiles and things like that. that are like T9, a million wounds, like 2+ save plus armor of contempt plus all this stuff. A similarly costed fortification with a bad ballistic skill, no good weapons, has a similar defensive profile, and we already know that those Land Raiders are not invincible. They can be killed. If it bleeds, we can kill it. And these fortifications sure do bleed. So the fortifications that act like normal units that have a defensive profile and can be attacked and can be destroyed should just be able to be placed wherever the F you want. None of those data sheets are particularly strong. Just let people play with their toys. That would be great. I would love that. The ones that like webway gates and stuff that like can actually impede movement and can't be attacked. First off, why? Just make them attackable. And the second thing is that I agree with that. They shouldn't be able to like wholly block off areas of the table. But if they can be destroyed, just make your opponent destroy them. Just get rid of them. All right, Astra Militarum. I made a video about Khazarkin, which I might release this week because I think I'm going to. It's if you're a patron, you've probably seen it, or a channel member. I posted up both places there. I made a mistake in my math. I did a bunch of math about how much damage the unit does. I made a mistake that affected all the math. That somebody in the comment section pointed out like a minute after the video was up, so thank God. So I took the video down. I was very proud of the video, unfortunately. But the gist of the video is that there's a Khazarkin Wombo combo that deals just around, on average, a little over 18 mortal wounds. It is distributed between multiple enemy units, so it's not drilling mortal wounds into a single thing, which is good because they would like kill at night. But it is a billion damage. For a 100-point unit, it's probably too much. And I think that it gives Astra Militarum like this counter punch that they don't necessarily need because they're already shooting you to death already. Cap that one to 6 mortal wounds. That one's easy. It should be 6 mortal wounds anyway. And the army, the codex hasn't even like been FAQ'd yet. That could be an FAQ. It probably will be, honestly. Oh no, Fortress of Redemption only uses basic terrain. Yeah, almost every time I see fortifications, they're just table terrain. It's like, I don't know. I have like a love-hate relationship with the idea of fortifications to begin with. But it's just so sad that this thing like that has a like imagine if rhinos only ever got used as wrecks. Like there was that Battlefield Ruin or the Battlefield like Dangerous Battlefield or whatever kit that they have that was like a blown up rhino with trees around it. Like what if that was the only like use case of the rhino, you know? Like it's this thing, it's a unit in the game that you can take, but you just never do. You use it as pieces. And it's like so sad. All right, Astra Militarum, easy fix. There's probably other things that need to be nerfed in Astra Militarum, but I don't know if we've seen enough play. Probably Leman Russ need to go up in points. A lot of their, like the Eradicator, is it Executioner? That's the Plasma Cannon Leman Russ. Like when you compare the profile to like anything else in the game, it's just like the efficiency of that gun is wild. So maybe that needs to get increased. I don't know. But I would hold off for a couple weeks before we start making dramatic changes to the Astra Militarum Codex because we haven't really seen it in play too much. Fortifications should be like a sideboard option you can swap in if you're a defender. That would be cool. If 40k were to be redesigned from the ground up, I bet that would be a change they make. They'll be like, the attacker gets to go first. It's very good for them, but you get a building. You'd be like, oh, sick. Thank you. That could be okay. Like I don't know. Alpha Strike's probably fine if you get like a big 200-point idiot that you can sit in your deployment zone and tank shots with. That'd be kind of sweet. If the game had asymmetry between attacker and defender, yeah, it should. It should have asymmetry. Call back to the first T5S2 Invitational we did, where we built. I spent fucking so long making asymmetric maps. And I was so proud of them because I was convinced. I had it was Darkwind and I. We put our heads together. We had a long and lengthy discussion when the 9th edition rules were being spoiled about how they were moving to like alternating deployments, but the community would probably house rule that we would use deploy first, go first. And I was like, yes, let's like be the change we want to see in the world. So I built asymmetric boards that incentivized to like the player going first had this huge advantage to running up the table, but the player going second could choose to take like a much more advantageous defensive position. And I with how powerful going first was in that edition, I think that we got, I mean, our sample size was tiny, but we got damn close to a 50% go first, go second. The map with the giant fort in the middle? Fuck yeah. That one was so sick. What do we call it? Militarum Air Base? Is that it? Yeah, that I really liked that one. Fortifications shouldn't be directly targetable as units. But that's like the point. The whole point is that they are, so that you can kill them if you need to. So any restriction on their positioning is not a problem. But if they're just a piece of terrain, then just use normal terrain. Like, why are we building these units that are just terrain? Terrain shouldn't be like included in your army. I don't know. Whatever. It's hard to balance asymmetry. Yeah, but it's like more fun. I have a lot of experience balancing asymmetry, chat. Hashtag shameless plug for Breachstorm. Sale for the rest of the week. If you want to play a real man's tabletop game, go to breachstorm.com. There you go. Shameless plug. That's the one I get for the stream. All right, let's move to Adeptus Mechanicus. I thought long and hard about Adeptus Mechanicus, and I thought that it sounds like the rumors are that they are just reducing points on a bunch of stuff, which is so boring, man. Like, I don't know. Eventually, you get to the point that Adeptus Mechanicus are just like the world's most numerous units in the game, and you have like 7-point Iron Strider Ballistari or something. And I feel like you're sort of paying lip service to rebalancing the faction, but not actually trying to do it. I think giving them like more interesting abilities would be cool. The one I came up with was that, and this would be like kind of RIP to Mars probably, but that's okay. Where the units that have Canticles of the Omnissiah, which is mostly the Tech Priest stuff, project the Canticles as an aura. So the big benefit of Mars right now is that all of its Skitarii also get Canticles. This would be a way to let you do that in any subfaction. So you can still play Lucius, and your Skitarii would be benefiting from like the reroll one hit roll thing or the other stuff, but only if you shepherded them with Tech Priests. And you could even do it with other Canticle units like Electro Priests and stuff. I think that it like sort of mechanically makes sense, or like thematically makes sense, because obviously if the Tech Priests are like sort of advising their Skitarii, they're going to be like, you know, able to work together more effectively, but also would be really strong. So, and it's not like an effect that we've never seen before. That's how original command protocols worked. They were just pulsed out of the characters, and it's also how Mars works, right? So it's not like, it's clearly not, you know, like a ridiculously silly ability. I just think it would be like this huge quality of life change that would kind of give people a new reason to play the faction. I don't know if that's the only change they would need, or if something else would happen, but I think a change like that, where they go back to the drawing board and change with their core mechanics, I think is what I would rather see than just continuously dropping the points on everything in the codex, which is just like sort of frustrating. I'd like to see attacker, defender, primaries, or secondaries. I think that'd be cool. Attacker and defender secondaries would be sweet. Like they sort of like hinted at that, right? With the, like, I don't know. They made a change for no reason, because they added in the latest Warzone season where you have to make the attacker defender roll before you pick secondary objectives, but the attacker defender roll doesn't do anything. So like, who cares? It just depends. It determines who deploys the first unit, which only matters if you both have forward deploy. So you can pick your if you want to like drop a banner on a forward objective, but your opponent's deploying their forward deploy first, you know you're not going to be able to do that. But that probably doesn't stop you from taking banners. So the situations in which that actually affects your secondary objective selection is so minimal. But it affects it in a huge way if you know you're going second. Suddenly grind them down becomes like the greatest secondary ever if you know you're going second. That's sick. Like, why don't they do that? I don't know. It's just stupid. Whatever. All right, that was what I have to say for Adeptus Mechanicus. Next up, Votan Judgment Tokens. They should probably go away at some point. I don't like that they are persistent throughout the entire game. Not only is it a very stupid mechanic, but also it's like impossible to keep track of. It's really obnoxious to keep track of. And just the fact that like you can continue to re-up them every turn, and they just continue to stack as the game goes on. So eventually, like as you get to round 5, just everything you have in your army wins everything in the opponent's army on 4s. A little silly. Now I think that I don't think they should be like a one-turn thing where they just drop every turn. But I think that after a unit attacks a unit with a judgment token, like remove 1 judgment token. So if you have a unit with a 4 stack, suddenly you have to sequence your shooting phase in a more interesting way. But then also, they're not just sitting there forever. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that. Should a fix to Adeptus Mechanicus be something like make it cult mechanics units not worthless? Doesn't that do that? Is that not what I just said? Your cult mechanicus units give your Skitari your canticles. Isn't that sweet? Oh my god. Suggesting judgment tokens go away. Yeah, little like judgment tokens just appeared next to me on my chair. Like, oh no, I'm wounded on 6s now. I'd better start talking. They'll wound me on 5s soon. Oh no. Heretic Astartes. I don't think Heretic Astartes is that broken, actually. I think the one sub-faction that might need looking at is Emperor's Children. Like, otherwise, I think Heretic Astartes are actually fine. Emperor's Children are, like, really good at shooting. Sort of unnecessarily so. And I think that... I said 12 inches here. Maybe it needs to be longer than that. I don't know. But right now, sonic weapons they give you +1 damage at half range. I think the real issue is that Blastmaster's range is way too long. But Blast Ranchers are either range 48 or 36, depending on the mode that you fire, which means that they get +1 damage at like 50% of the board. like they cover their +1 damage covers like every effective area your opponent can stand in. Since they usually get +1 damage at 12 or at 24. And most there are guns in the game that shoot 24 inches and are never out of range. So it feels like, especially Blastmasters are like just always +1 damage. And I think that, I mean, it's like so integral to how strong this sub-faction is. It would also be a buff for the shorter range weapons if you made it a flat range. And like nobody takes Doom Sirens right now, but if Doom Sirens just went to being 2 damage all the time, you would like suddenly consider it. I don't know, that's kind of off the cuff. That was like the one thing I could think of in Heretic Astartes that wasn't already covered by other discussions that I was like, I don't know, kind of questioning. Chaos Demons. Apparently Flamers are getting dumpstered with like a bunch of weird changes that nobody understands and no one has any concrete evidence for, so who knows. But also, the way they interface with Heretic Astartes is stupid. Right now, you can take in the cult-specific sub-faction, so Emperor's Children, Death Guard, or Emperor's Children specifically, I think. You can take any Chaos Demon. Get rid of that. That's easy. Otherwise, I think Chaos Demons are fine. I don't think I would change anything. Is that even a Chaos Demon roll? I think it's just a Heretic Astartes roll. Maybe that could have wrapped up in the same thing. That's more like a required FAQ than a real balance change. Speaking of required FAQs, the Webway Gate and Yannari secondaries are still busted, like 6 months after the Rita Saved the Codex. GW. Get your act together. What are you doing? Why are these things like still mechanically destroyed? Creations of Bile, Fight on Death on a 3+? Unnecessary, I would say. I think that Creations of Bile, I don't know. I'm not prepared to say I think Creations of Bile is overpowered, needs a nerf. I think it's fine. So, that's what I have to say. What am I getting? Officially dictate you can't cheese it setup. Oh, I don't care about that. Ooh, whatever. That's like, as soon as you start like dictating how people place like multi-model units, you just like, the game gets ridiculous. And if you can stick the two webway arcs together, whatever, I don't care. The problem right now is that it breaks your Strands of Fate if you take it, which is stupid because it's not a Craft Worlds unit. It's an Azure Yanni unit, but it's not in a Craft World. The other problem, obviously, is with Ynnari. Ynnari bring non-Azure Yanni units into your army, which means that rules, according to the Nephilim book, you cannot take Azure Yanni secondaries because you're not 100%, and they have no clause that states that you can, which is stupid. It's just really stupid. Fix that. That's clearly not supposed to work that way, but whatever. It is what it is. Do I think it's a good thing that Abaddon can just go in any Chaos Army it's not included? Yeah, he's potentially going up points. I think it's like whatever, honestly. I don't feel... I think that it's fine that Abaddon goes into non-Black Legion Chaos Armies because he is like... Every faction is getting like a face character, right? So like, you know, Silent King has Necrons, and Imperium theoretically is supposed to have Gilliman, although he's like kind of Garbo. And Chaos gets, Orcs get Ghazghkull, and Chaos gets Abaddon. And I don't think that he's like so busted that he's like carrying the faction by himself or whatever. I think he's just a very good character. But he's still like a, 1/6 of your army. Disagree about it not mattering. If you set up in the picture, your opponent can try to physically block you out. If you do it the other way, it's a foot diameter circle. Oh, I mean, I agree with you. If you're not trying to expand the range that you're scoring Hidden Path, which oftentimes is a consideration, then you should be placing the two struts together. But I think that's fine. Like, I honestly... how do you even dictate, like, that it changes? Like, you put a diagram? You're like, this has to be set up this way? It just gets really weird. And then, like, what does that mean for other, like, units that are similar to that have multiple parts to them? Like, it's an open question how you're actually supposed to set up a Battle Sanctum on the table. Like, should they send you a picture? Should they write it out? Should they describe it? I think it's like this weird, like... I think it's a rabbit hole that you don't need to go down, and because I think mechanically it works just fine the way it is. Just hope they will not nerf Necrons too much. Play WTC format, 1 to 4 points is a draw. So AVJ mod, here's my advice to you is not to do that. Play a different format that doesn't have a weird draw mechanic that's unnecessary. We've done it suddenly. It doesn't matter so much. How about setting up a mech workshop? Yeah, I think Mech Workshop is another good example, right? I think that there should be a rule about... Mech Workshop, it has a rule for its setup, right? I know I specified in my judgment document, I have a rule about fortifications that don't have any... what's the word? Any setup rules associated with them. Oh yeah, all of the little bits just get stuck within 6 inches of the workshop. Yeah. So like, I think you should. I mean, part of the benefit, like a Mech Boy Workshop is garbage. It's one of the worst models in the 40k. But one of the benefits of taking it, and I think this is the same for the Webway Gate, is that you should have freedom for how you set up all of the components. So if you want to use them, if you want to weaponize them in some way, because they are like unstable positions. They're not scalable, interestingly. And I don't know how tall they are, so I don't know if they prevent you from climbing. But if you want to use them to block off like avenues of attack or something, you're paying 70 points to do that. You should be able to. So I think that, I think that's fine. Do I think team format should use the core 40k rules, or WTC ATC scoring is appropriate for wholly distinct formats. So I mean, speaking personally, I don't like the WTC format, but I think I don't like it specifically because of the tying issue, which is just like something that they just introduced. I think that there are arguments to be made for both a WTC style where your final scores matter versus I don't know what ATC uses. I've never been there. But versus a raw wins system where only winning matters. And I think both of those are appropriate. I don't think that like a GT format should dictate how team tournaments work, because I think those are wholly separate. So I think it's like, I don't know. Like for team events are so divorced from a regular game of 40k that I don't think that the core rules should be taken as like gospel for how they're scored, if core rules even existed for them. Chaos Space Marines might need a buff in the upcoming data set if they lose Armor of Contempt. I mean, I don't know about that. I do agree that they're Chaos Space Marines are kind of like one note right now, and that's unfortunate. But I think that's just like, I don't know. That might just be Black Rune of Damnation being stupid. ATC is 20-point games. Wins must be more than 10. Yeah, so that's just WTC, right? Yeah, I don't like that. I don't think in a game or in a game like 40k where you don't play, like there's not a huge sample size, like you don't play 20 games in a weekend. I don't think that the rules should incentivize tying. When you only have like 5 games to play, tying one of them is just like real dumb. I think ties should be very rare. So I'm like conceptually against the 10-point draw rule in those team formats. And I think it's even worse when people, like, there's so many events that transfer those rules over to single events, and then there's a draw like cap inside the single game. That's ridiculous. What are you doing? That should not be the case. Individual games cannot tie. Well, it doesn't matter if individual games tie, right? Yeah, because you don't care about the final. You don't care about win loss. You only care about winning by a certain amount. And I don't love that system, but I do think that it's an interesting format. And I think those are examples of interesting ways to change the format without, like, I don't know, being weird about terrain or whatever. But honestly, I'm like, I don't know. I'm not particularly enfranchised in the team tournament like community, so I don't know if I'm like an authority. I just have opinions about team tournament scoring. I think it's funny every time I look at a WTC event and there's like 20 ties in it. I'm just like, oh, cool. We've certainly determined who the most skilled team is. It's the one that can tie more often. With Tyranids becoming the prime antagonist at 10th edition, do I think they'll become low tier due to all the following 10th edition codexes increasing the power level from 10th to 10th edition launch? I'm not sure what that means. The prime antagonists, like they were good in 9th, and so they're gonna be bad in 10th or whatever. I mean, maybe. If Tyranids get hammered in this data slate and don't get like updated in a big way in an upcoming edition, they will probably be bad for a really long time. But I don't know. I don't really want to say until a new edition comes out. All right. Anyway, chat. That is all my slides that I have. So I think we will. I'll chill out for a little while longer as we wrap up the show here. So if anybody else has some more questions, comments, or concerns they can bring up, just rampant flaming. That's also works too. Then I'm going to go ahead and shut things down momentarily. The implication is that they will be an early codex. I mean, maybe. Like, we saw Necrons be an early codex and then be, like, totally fine for a while and then be broken for a hot minute in what's the word? In this past edition. So, like, I don't think that, and I wouldn't say that, like, if I were going to come and hit a Necron.
We enjoy it equals.
Hey, Lyle, thanks for the $2, man. Appreciate you. $2.02. Look at that. Appreciate you. I think that we're at a point where, like, I wouldn't, like, write off a codex because of its position in the release cycle right now. One thing I will say about the current format, and you know, I'll commend the GW design team on, is that they have been doing a pretty good job at, like, making sure at least the codexes aren't, like, just worthless. You basically can't rock up to a game in a tournament right now and look at your opponent's army and be like, oh, I'm 100% gonna win, because most armies have, like, decent game plans. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can speculate whether or not that will continue through a new edition where everything's different, but I do think that they have shown that they're okay at keeping factions relevant past, like, their prime. If Flamers must hit on 4s, they're dead. Probably, maybe. Yeah, I don't. that one, I don't know how much I even believe that rumor, because, like, do you implement multiple nerfs to them? Like, do you change their core weapon, so you remove the auto hit from their weapon and change their ballistic skill, or do you make it so they don't get, like, benefits of plus ballistic skill effects and you make the weapon only hit on 4s? Like, it would just be a weird change regardless of what they did. So I don't know. I have no idea what to think about that change. If they just roll to hit normally, I think Flamers are actually fine. If they roll to hit normally and only hit on 4s, I think they're going to be tough to get to see play. And if they, like, get a bunch of changes and a huge points increase, that would also be tough. But I think I don't know. I think it'll be interesting. The old triple points and a hit and a ballistic skill removal. Yeah, I hope, man. They've been so good about over nerfing recently. I mean, every once in a while they hit up, like, they just destroy a faction, right? They destroy a unit, but, like, it has not happened in so long. Just knock my microphone around. Their data sites have been real calm, just, like, you know, real based. And I think if this one they just come out swinging and they just dumpster a bunch of stuff, like, it's gonna suck. It's gonna be so brutal. Quadruple nerf, yeah. So Flamers, like, their weapon becomes heavy, only hits on 4s. They go up, like, 9 points, and I don't know. Like, their ballistic skill also changes. They go to ballistic skill 5 with a heavy weapon and go up points. How's that? There you go. We did it. All right, chat. I'm gonna go ahead and wrap things up. I am glad everyone came to hang out. I think this is a good discussion. We talked about a bunch of stuff, and I had a good time. So I hope everyone also had a good time. Hopefully by this time next week, we'll see some actual physical rules in our hands. So I'm crossing my fingers for that. So anyway, chat, thanks everyone for chilling with me. Lyle, thanks for the dono at the end there. And I am gonna see you all later. So come back next week. Hopefully we'll have some actual events to talk about, and maybe some new spicy hot rules to discuss. But otherwise, stay tuned for more content. I released a short or a clip over on my second channel earlier today. I've been doing some short content lately as well. I think I'm gonna try to do a short a week or so, just to keep things going over there. And those and my clip stuff is all going over to my TikTok as well. So if you want to get me in bite-sized chunks, you can go hang out with me on TikTok. I'm going for 10K by the end of the year on TikTok, which should be pretty good. I released a video on Death Watch randomly that like exploded. I got 90,000 views and I went up like 1,200 followers in like a day, which was pretty sweet. Felt pretty good. Flamers become a fortification, can't be deployed within 3. Got him. That's funny. All right, everybody. Thanks, everyone. I'll see ya. And remember to keep it classy, folks. And